Hey there, welcome to Heroes and Villains of Literature. Thanks for stopping by. This is my second channel. My other channel is a gaming channel, Evil Owlcard 13, twitch.tv. Just throwing it out there in case any of you happen to be gamers. All of us have multiple hobbies, I'm sure. So the purpose of this channel is to discuss protagonists and their antagonists from various novels, some popular, some not so popular, some obscure but definitely need light shed upon them. So I'm thinking for my inaugural video, I'm going to start with someone easy, someone probably the most well-known of the protagonists I'm going to go over. He's up there with Dracula. In a couple hundred years, he may even surpass Dracula. His name is Lestat de Lioncourt.
I am the vampire Lestat. I'm immortal, more or less. The light of the sun, the sustained heat of an intense fire. These things might destroy me. But then again, they might not. I'm 6 feet tall, which was fairly impressive in the 1780s when I was a young, mortal man. It's not bad now. I have thick, blonde hair, not quite shoulder length, and rather curly, which appears white under fluorescent light. My eyes are grey, but they absorb the colors blue or violet easily from surfaces around them. And I have a fairly short, narrow nose, and a mouth that is well-shaped but just a little too big for my face. It can look very mean, or extremely generous, my mouth. It always looks sensual. But emotions and attitudes are always reflected in my entire expression. I have a continuously animated face. My vampire nature reveals itself in extremely white and highly reflective skin that has to be powdered down for cameras of any kind. And if I'm starved for blood, I look like a perfect horror. Skin shrunken, veins like ropes over the contours of my bones. But I don't let that happen now. And the only consistent indication that I am not human is my fingernails. It's the same with all vampires. Our fingernails look like glass. And some people notice that when they don't notice anything else.
To jump into it, let me describe Lestat currently, I guess you could say, before I go into his backstory, in case you don't know who he is. So Lestat is a vampire who's roughly around 250 years in age as of the most recent of the books, Prince Lestat and the Realms of Atlantis. Yeah. So he's 250 years old. He's relatively young because these vampires have been around for thousands of years, their oldest being well over 6,000 years old and originating in Egypt. That's where their species comes from. They have an origin story, unlike a lot of vampires in lore you see today. So, Lestat, as I said, is a reckless, carefree kind of character. So he travels or traipses throughout the world, throughout his 250 years on Earth, meeting other immortals, starting shit, causing all kinds of ruckus all over the place, and he is a catalyst for quite a few large events in the vampire world. Lestat has, I would say, 6 or 7 fledglings. His first one was Gabrielle, his own mother. His second one was Nicholas de Lafont, who is deceased, and one of his best friends. Around the same time he created Gabrielle, he created her. Then there's Louis Dupont de Lac, who he meets in New Orleans 10 to 20 years after he comes into the blood. After Louis is Claudia. After Claudia, by the way, is a child vampire. She was played by Kirsten Dunst in the movie Interview with the Vampire. About a 5-year-old little girl, Lestat turns into a vampire for Louis. And for himself, truth be told. After Claudia, there's Antoine, who is a French musician who was there for much the same reason. They were all in the New World, and Lestat turned him. Then after Antoine, there is David Talbot, who was the superior general of an order called the Talamasca. After David, I believe it's Mona Mayfair, who is a witch from another Anne Rice series that Lestat turned into a vampire. That happens in the books called Blackwood Farm and Blood Canonical. After Mona, there is Rose. And there was another one after her. I'm going to have to do the research on his name. He's the most recent, as of the most recent book. He's a architect that works for Lestat that he ends up turning into a vampire. So that's his fledglings. The term fledgling means young vampire or child of the vampire that's referring to them as a fledge. So, as a mortal, Lestat was born in 1760 to the Marquis d'Auvergne in the Auvergne region of France. Back in those times, basically what it was a siege castle with a village that was built right outside of its gates. The castle, Chateau de Liancourt, is located on top of sort of like a mountain. So the village is down a mountain a little bit out in the open area from the castle. And then this entire area is surrounded by mountainous territory. So they're just a remote castle in the middle of nowhere with a village. That's where he grew up. So he was the youngest of 7 born to the Marquis and his wife, Gabrielle. Lestat was only one of 3 to survive to adulthood. The rest died as children. He was the youngest, so he was treated differently. His brother Augustin was the perceived heir to the Marquis. His father, whose name we don't know, we'll just call him the Marquis, is at this point a blind older man. His mother was pretty young, from Italy, I believe. She speaks Italian, French, Latin, stuff like that. She's well educated. So it was an arranged marriage, and she bore him 7 children. He went blind, so his brothers wouldn't step up to rule over the region that their family controls. So even as the youngest, he had to step up and become lord of the region. But when he was a child, they tried to get him educated with a group of monks, and to learn how to read and write and stuff like that, so he could be the workhorse of the family. He enjoyed his schooling with the monks so much that he wanted to join the order and become a brother. His father didn't like that, and he had him dragged home kicking and screaming. And that was it for his education. All he really learned from the experience was to write his name and write some Bible verses and hymns that he learned with the monks. A few years would pass, during which time he would become the main provider for the family, going out to the mountain regions, hunting for food and stuff like that. A few years would pass this way, and he would meet a troupe of actors. Acrobats, singers, just a troupe of gypsy entertainers. He enjoyed their show so much at a town festival that was being held that he slipped away with them in the night and became their Lelio, basically their main actor, overnight. When they got to almost Paris, his father and his brother had found him and dragged him home. Now, mind you, all this time that he was out with the troupe, he was writing letters to his mother. His mother was sending him money. She wanted him to escape. He was basically the only one of her children that she cared for and even passingly doted on. Lestat was it for her. So they drag him home, and he once again becomes the Hunter Lord, and he dives into that in full earnest. He raises mastiff hunting dogs, 2 huge ones. He ends up buying all kinds of guns, and in his castle there's all kinds of swords and maces and stuff like that, so he's got a pretty good arsenal of weapons, and he becomes both the hunter and the protector of the region. That being said, right around the time Lestat was about 17 or 18, the village heads come to him with a problem. A pack of wolves in the mountains, about 8 to 10 of them, have been terrorizing the village, killing their pets, killing their livestock, and they need them killed. So they go to Lestat and ask if he could do it. Lestat, being the brash, devil-may-care person that he is, no fear, says, hell yeah, I'll go. Let me grab a couple of guns, a mace, a sword, my dogs, and that's it. Let's go. So he, his dogs, his horse, and all his weapons, I swear he grabbed like 3 or 4 guns, and, a mace, like a flail, a ball and a chain. He had one of them, and a sword. So he goes out there, and he ends up facing an entire pack of wolves, around 10 of them. Both of his dogs are killed in the fight, and so is his horse. But he, by himself, kills every single wolf. It was a hard fight. It was rough, but ultimately he outlasted the wolves, and he killed all of them. And he left their bodies there, and he walked back to the village, minus several of his weapons. I think he only had a sword left with him. And he goes up into his castle, and he has kind of like a half nervous breakdown where he goes quiet for a few days. The experience traumatized him, even though he prevailed. It just did something to him. Anyway, his mother comes to him. He tells her about it, and she understands, whatever. Tells him that the local tavern keeper and his son Nicholas have come to show their gratitude to Lestat for killing the wolves by bringing him a cloak made with the fur of the dead wolves. Lestat goes down to accept this gift and instantly becomes the best of friends with the innkeeper's son, Nicholas. From that day forward, they were pretty much inseparable. Drank every night, stayed up being rowdy, and get deep into conversations which they called their conversation, their ongoing conversation. To them, their conversation never ended. They just picked up where they left off. This goes on for months, to the point where the Marquis is sick of it, the innkeeper is sick of it. I mean, he's happy that his son is hanging out with the son of the Marquis, but they're sick of it because they drink, they're rowdy, they stay up all night, they keep the villagers awake, whatever. So one night, Lestat and Nicholas are out in a field because they were kicked out of the inn. They've reached their golden moment and decided that it was the perfect time to run away together, live in Paris, and just do whatever. Just leave with what they have and go live in Paris. At first, Nicholas thought Lestat was just kidding around. Lestat was not kidding around. So they ended up actually going to Paris. Gabrielle, Lestat's mother, sold some of her jewelry and stuff to fund the expedition on the condition that Lestat write her in Italian, so his brothers and father couldn't understand the correspondence. So they get to Paris. Nicholas ends up becoming a violinist for a theater called Renault's. Lestat ends up becoming their backstage helper. He helps the actors get dressed, he cleans up, all that stuff. Eventually, they work their way to Nicky being the main violinist in the orchestra, and Lestat, once again, being the leading man for the acting troupe. It gets to the point where even nobles are coming to see them act. This is important because they're gathering the attention of everyone in France. Everyone also includes You guessed it, a vampire. So during one of Lestat's performances, he notices a stark white face in the crowd watching him. And every time he sees this face, he hears a voice in his mind calling him Wolf Killer. Wolf Killer. And that's all it says, Wolf Killer. He sees this face multiple times throughout a couple of weeks. It disappears for a little bit, but it always returns. Lestat gets scared and tells Nicholas what's going on because he doesn't want to feel crazy. He wants someone else to be aware of it and see if maybe Nikki saw it too. Nicholas doesn't believe him, and in fact ends up becoming pretty resentful of Lestat's success because Nicholas had always been a violinist, but he started learning so late in life he knew he was never going to be good, and everything just came easy for Lestat. No matter what he did, he succeeded. And Nicholas thought he was always going to be a failure and that he deserved to be a failure. So he snaps on Lestat, and then they go to bed fighting. That night, something breaks in and kidnaps Lestat. It ends up being the vampire Magnus, who lives in another castle located just outside of Paris. So Magnus kidnaps Lestat, brings him to his castle, and keeps him locked up over a period of a couple days, maybe even a week, feeding him, keeping him barely alive, and drinking his blood. When Lestat asks why and tries to bargain his way out of the situation, Magnus tells him that he was chosen because he was the Wolf Killer. And because Lestat was the physical personification of what Magnus himself wanted to be, because Magnus was just this craggly old man who had just like a distorted body, black greasy hair. He was not the most handsome of men. He was no George Clooney. So he ends up, long story short, creating Lestat that very night that Lestat starts asking him questions. Right after he creates Lestat, he commits suicide by immolating himself in a bonfire. But not before telling Lestat that everything he owns now belongs to Lestat, including his fortune, which is several chests of gold inside of a hidden room in the wall where Lestat would go on to take his rest during the day. So, eventually, the fact that Lestat is missing gets to his mother's ears, and she ends up traveling to France. After a few correspondence with him, a few correspondence with Nikki, something's up, and she travels to France, where Lestat is informed that she also happens to be dying from consumption. Perhaps even from damage done by the fact that she bore 7 children. So she's on her deathbed, and Lestat visits her on the very night she's set to die. He ends up revealing that he's a vampire, and he turns her, his first fledgling. Together, they disappear into the night, answering no one's questions. Lestat takes Gabrielle back to his castle, teaches her all the things she needs to know about being a newborn vampire, the fact that once you drink the blood, you'll experience a physical death, but you won't actually die. It only hurts for a short while, then you're made anew. He also cuts her hair to make her look like a male. They kill somebody, dress her up as a boy, and they go out hunting. This is how Gabrielle would choose to hunt for a little bit before she starts dressing in like safari clothes and stuff. So Lestat finds out that Nicholas is just in a terrible way since Gabrielle and Lestat's disappearance. Like, he's drinking constantly, he's ranting to himself, and he's just generally in a poor mental state. So Lestat gets the bright idea that maybe he should create Nikki too. Gabrielle protests. Don't turn Nicholas. Don't do it. You'll regret it. He does it anyway. Almost as soon as he turns Nicholas turns on him. Like, they were always enemies the whole time. They were the opposite sides of the same coin. Nicholas is now his rival, kind of deal. That's how Nicholas took it. During all of this, Lestat meets like a cult, like a vampiric cult called the Children of Satan. They're living in the cemetery, in the old Les Innocents cemetery, basically the catacombs where the walls were lined with skulls and stuff, into like atriums, like huge rooms underground. They still exist to this day, even though they covered it up. Those catacombs still exist miles and miles and miles underneath France. That's where the Coven was living. And there were Christian zealots. They believed their purpose in life was to serve Satan. By serving Satan, they're serving God. That vampires are pure evil. And that they could not go in the churches, right? Any holy place, they were not allowed. And that they needed to live in cemeteries and sleep in coffins and live in squalor, only wear rags, stuff like that. Alright, so I had to two-part this. Welcome back. I was talking about the Children of Satan and the catacombs beneath France. So, what I was saying is Lestat meets them, right? And they're led by a vampire named Armand, an elder among the undead at that point in time, and as far as Armand knew, possibly the oldest living vampire in existence. Because at this point, the vampire world is in total disarray. There's no law, no order. They're, covens forming their own laws and enforcing them on maverick and vagabond vampires that just happen into their territory. So Lestat and Gabrielle run into these people. At first, they're just a presence following them around Paris and all the way back to Magnus's castle. And at some point, they are attacked by these vampires. Not really forced into too much of a fight, just kind of harassed and bullied a little bit. Leading up to a chase into Notre Dame, where Lestat and Gabrielle take refuge in Notre Dame because they know for a fact that these vampires will not enter the church. The one that does enter the church, however, is their leader, Armand. He sends his followers away and enters the church to have a conversation with Lestat and try to force him out of the church. Little does Armand know that Lestat's bloodline is pretty powerful. Lestat was created by Magnus, who was created by way of blood rape by Benedict, who was created by Rashomandis. Rashomandis is over 6,000 years old. His blood is potent. At this point, I would say Benedict is over 1,000 years old and has only made one other vampire, Notker the Wise. And Magnus made no one. In 500 years, he made no one. So, when he created Lestat, Lestat was made powerful. About the same power, if not a little more powerful, than Armand, who himself at this point is roughly 300 to 400 years old. Armand, by the way, was created by Marius de Romanus, who I will talk about shortly. So, they get into this little kerfuffle. Lestat knocks Armand out of the church and starts yelling at Armand's followers how their leader walked to the church, how they walked to the church, and nothing happened to them. God has no dominion over them. This is like one of Lestat's mantras. God has no dominion. Hell has no dominion. So, they end up leaving with the Coven at some point to go down into the catacombs. Actually, no. So, that doesn't happen. My bad. That's a mistake. I'm probably going to edit that out. So, at some point, while Nicholas is still human, the Coven kidnaps him and brings him down into the catacombs and uses him as like a blood slave and as leverage against Lestat and Gabrielle. At this point, Nicholas is half mad, if not completely mad, from all the events that transpired. Lestat and Gabrielle go down to the catacombs to confront the Coven, and with pure logic alone, destroys everything the Coven believes in, thereby disbanding the Children of Satan. Armand can't handle this, so he starts systematically killing the members of his Coven with ruthless conviction. He doesn't care. At this point, his world is destroyed. Everything he knew up to this point is destroyed. Lestat helps some of the remaining members of the Coven to create their own Coven. Now, at this point in time, Lestat had become worried about the acting troupe him and Nicholas had worked with, so he paid for them to move on to bigger, better things in Rome, I think it was. So he moved out Renault's, and now Lestat is the owner of this theater. Why that's important is the vampires from the Children of Satan that he helps, Eleni, Eugenie, and I forget the last dude's, Felix, I think? Something like that. There was 3 or 4 of them. He gives them refuge inside the theater where Renault was originally stationed. Tells them how to live as mortals, how to blend in with society. Gives them some money to fix up the theater and do what they want with it. They take Lestat and Gabrielle, take Nikki back to the castle. Gabrielle vehemently rejects Lestat's idea of turning Nicholas. Lestat does it anyway. Once it's done, Nicholas is unresponsive. Doesn't want to talk to anybody but Gabrielle. They can hear each other's thoughts. That's another thing. Master and Fledgling cannot hear each other's thoughts. Too close in the blood, I suppose. But Gabrielle and Nikki can hear each other. So Gabrielle knows how much in turmoil Nicholas is. Lestat is just oblivious to it. So one day Nicholas disappears during a hunting trip and ends up in Renault's. Lestat finds him there, and he's playing the violin by himself in the middle of the theater. To which he demands, at such point in time, Nikki demands that Lestat give him ownership of the theater so he can create the Théâtre des Vampires, Theater of the Vampires, an establishment owned, operated by vampires. And Nikki's idea was to just lure hapless victims there, kill them, and maybe just start turning people indiscriminately. Lestat at this point is just like, whatever, you can have it, because the Children of Satan that had survived begged Lestat to let them do that. Like they absorbed Nicholas into their coven, and now the Théâtre des Vampires is the thing. This is when Gabrielle and Lestat decide to leave France. Leave Nikki to his own devices, leave the Coven to their own devices, make sure they're taken care of independently of Lestat, and they left France. Armand eventually joins the Coven and takes over the role of Coven Master again, and again, as I said, the Théâtre des Vampires is born. Very successful theater, by the way, because of its dark and gothic nature. For that period of time, it was just thrilling to the Parisians. Shut up. After Gabrielle and Lestat leave France, they're together for a period of time, indeterminate amount of years, about 10 years. And but eventually they grow apart. Gabrielle starts leaving for longer and longer periods of time, until eventually she leaves altogether with the promise that if Lestat ever decides to end his life, that he find her first, because she doesn't want to live life wondering if Lestat's alive or dead. It's her son, as far as she's concerned, her only child. So when this happens, Lestat goes into a period of depression that just about every vampire goes into at some point in their existence, and some of them it happens to multiple times, and he goes down into the earth. But not before leaving a message for Marius, because while they were in Paris, after they had met Armand came to them and had a conversation and told Lestat and Gabrielle about his past and his master, and the fact that Marius may still be alive but is most likely dead. Lestat is enamored with the idea, the legend of Marius, so he goes around the world with Gabrielle, and in every place they go before she leaves, he scrawls a message on a wall somewhere for him. Marius sees one of these and goes looking for Lestat. He finds him underneath of a house in Egypt, I believe. So Marius finds Lestat, brings him back to his island, which is somewhere in Haiti, I believe. Maybe even... no, it's Greece. He's living in Greece at the time, on an island, in a castle in the middle of, like, the ocean. So, it doesn't really matter where his location was, but that's where he was living at the time. He brings him there and gives him hospitality, dresses him, and all that stuff, and then proceeds to tell Lestat something that would change the course of history for all vampires from that point on, once Lestat has the information, and that is the origin story of their species. Tells him of the creation of the first vampires, Akasha and Enkil, who were the pharaoh and the queen of Kemet in Egypt. About 5,700 years prior, give or take. About how they created a blood religion. About how there was a vampiric war between Queen's Blood, which were the vampires sworn to serve Akasha, and the first Brood, who were the renegades who chose to fight Akasha and Enkil. And the members of the first Brood are Maharet, Makare, and Cayman. Maharet and Makare are twins. They were considered witches at the time because of their red hair and green eyes and their ability to talk to spirits. That's why Akasha sought them out, and they were punished. I'll probably talk about that in another video, because it will come into play later in Lestat's story. So Marius tells Lestat all of this, and then brings him down to the shrine where he keeps the divine parents. Up until this point, he had never told very many people that he was in possession of the divine pair, because by this point in time, Akasha and Enkil are living statues. They don't move, they don't do anything, they just sit there. They occasionally feed, and Enkil will stand up to defend Akasha if somebody like forcefully tries to take her blood, but he doesn't do anything more than stand up and kill. That's it. Like, you don't even see him move, you don't see him do nothing. They're statues. So Marius offers blood to Lestat, and he accepts. He drinks Akasha's blood, not Enkil's. Enkil becomes enraged by this and forcefully removes Lestat. At that point, Marius decides it's time to banish Lestat from his presence. He doesn't want to, but he has to, because Lestat's mere presence enrages Enkil to the point where now he's destroying the shrine he's kept in. So that's that for his time with Marius. Another, I would say, few years, I would say about 5 years passes, and now Lestat ends up in New Orleans. He's alone, you know, and he seeks out the New World to start over. He's taking care of his father, because during the French Revolution, the noble families were overthrown by the peasants, as history tells us. That this was around the time Marie Antoinette and her husband, I forget his name, were beheaded. The monarchy was overthrown, and all the noble families were killed by the peasants. And that's what happened to Lestat's family. The only survivor was his father, who was blind and crippled at this time, bedridden. He's shipped off to the New World. Lestat goes there to take care of him, and that's where he notices a young plantation owner by the name of Louis Dupont du Lac. He turns Louis, who by this point is destitute, not destitute in the way that he's poor, but he's in a bad way because his wife and child died during the birth of the child. His brother died. He's just got nobody. He's got no family. He's got nobody. He's just got a ton of money and a plantation that he doesn't give a fuck about. So Lestat turns him so he can take over Louis's plantation and stuff. Well, that's what Louis says, but as we know, Lestat is pretty well off himself. His father's rich because of the money Lestat sent him over time. Lestat is rich in his own right because of the fortune given to him by Magnus, as well as his business dealings, like with the Théâtre des Vampires and other things. Like, Lestat is very money savvy, so he doesn't need anything Louis has. He really just wants Louis. But in the book Interview with the Vampire, Louis passes it off as Lestat just wants everything he has. Becoming a vampire doesn't do much for Louis. He's actually weak because by this point he's the third vampire made by Lestat, so he's considerably weaker. In those days, the more vampires you made, the weaker they became because of the dilution of the blood. The power didn't have enough time to rebuild itself, I guess. So Louis was fairly weak, couldn't even read people's minds. You know what I mean? So he was loath to kill anybody. Lestat was trying to get him to kill the evildoer, but Louis had no way of knowing who an evildoer was because he could not read minds the way Lestat and Gabrielle could. So, I forgot to mention. Before Gabrielle left Lestat, she revealed to him that Nikki had committed suicide. He with the approval of Armand. So Armand cut off Nikki's hands because of his incessant violin playing, and he wrote tons and tons of plays for the Théâtre des Vampires that would last him for years to come. And Armand cut off his hands. Nikki told Armand to send his hands as well as his violin to his maker, and then he asked to be immolated because he could no longer travel on the Devil's Road anymore. He was mad at this point. Gabrielle kept that from Lestat for a little while, as well as letters from the vampires themselves, letters from his lawyers about the acting troupe Renault, about his father, all of the letters that had been coming to him. And Lestat didn't notice because he was kind of absorbed in the French Revolution that was going on at the time, so he wasn't aware of any of the other things going on around him. And Gabrielle kept all these letters from him in a bundle buried in the backyard, and the night she left him, she gave him the letters with an ultimatum: don't go to them or I'll leave. And he says, I can't, my mortal family is still alive, my mortal friends are still alive, so I'm going to be there for them while I still can. And she was full on vampire. She doesn't care about the living, so she's like, okay, peace out. That's why she left. So once he reads the letter about his father, then he goes to New Orleans and all that stuff happens with Louis. So Louis is not having a good way. He's looking like he's going down the same path as Nicholas, which is why Lestat creates Claudia. Once he creates Claudia, Louis starts drinking human blood and hunting and being a part of the family. Claudia is a ruthless killer. 5-year-old child, ruthless killer. She doesn't care. She's weaker than Louis, but she doesn't care. She'll kill anyone. Her and Lestat clear out whole families. I'm assuming that Lestat's the one that ferrets out. Stop! Lestat's the one that ferrets out the evildoer. So Lestat's the one that ferrets out the evildoer, most likely, and they finish off entire families. After about 80 years, the world changes around them. Horse-drawn buggies and sailboats give way to steam engines and trains. The colony that they knew is gone, and Claudia is now 80 years older, but still a 5-year child, which she begins to resent. She will forever be a child. She realizes she will forever be a child. She will never grow into a woman. She will never be anything more than what she is. So she begins to plot Lestat's death for turning her, which they eventually try to carry out, her and Louis. Louis just helps because of his love for Claudia. He doesn't want Lestat to hurt her. He doesn't exactly want to hurt Lestat. He loves Lestat, but he does it anyway, and they try to hide his body. Little did they know, because Lestat never told them, that it takes a little more than slitting someone's throat and throwing them in a swamp to kill them if they're a vampire. Lestat comes back from the swamp after feeding on crocodiles and snakes and rats and whatever he can get his hands on. And as they're trying to leave for Paris, because Louis and Claudia have never been to Paris, so they want to go to Paris, and they're about to leave, Lestat shows up, at which point they then burn him. Lestat survives that because of how powerful he is after drinking the blood of the mother. Basically, he's unkillable at this point in time, and he's only 100 years old in the blood. He cannot be killed at this point. Even Marius himself says there's basically no limit to Lestat's power. He could be the strongest vampire in the world. Nobody knows. A lot of people have tried to kill him over the centuries, and it never goes well for them. He even managed to kill a vampire that's 6,000 years old, and he does it brutally. So I got to tell this story just to illustrate how powerful Lestat is. So a 6,000-year-old vampire can, with one punch, knock down a building. They can fly. They can set someone on fire with their mind. They can cast a spell and control your mind. They can move shit with their mind. They are gods, essentially. You know what I mean? And their skin is like marble, like really dense marble. Like it's hard to penetrate even with conventional weapons. So the only way to kill a 6,000-year-old immortal, as far as they know, because they even sleep in the sun, where younger vampires can't even go out in the sun because they will instantly die, a 6,000-year-old vampire will actually sleep in the sun openly. You know what I mean? To get a little color, to get a tan. That's, you know what I mean? That's how powerful they are. So what Lestat does to this vampire is he plays like he's weak. He sneak attacks him, headbutts him in the face. Then he begins to rip out his eyes. He rips out the vampire's eyes, swallows them, crushes his skull in, and then repeatedly burns him over and over and over and over and over again. And then he cuts his head off with a with an axe that he had special made for fighting other vampires. A 250-year-old vampire was able to do that to the very oldest of their kind with little effort. Oh, and then he takes the body and flies entirely around the world to escape the sun so he can get back to where he lives. No other vampire can do that. None. No other vampire. It's just crazy how powerful Lestat is. So Louis and Claudia try to kill him. They believe they succeed. They end up in Paris. Lestat ends up there as well. He survives the burning, and that's when he makes Antoine, and Antoine helps him heal up a little bit, get some blood and heal the burns. Lestat then leaves Antoine and takes a boat to Paris, and Antoine's lost to time for, 150 years, something like that, until future events happen. When Louis and Claudia arrive in Paris, the people who've seen the movies know what happens. The Armand and his coven, who happen to be acquainted with Lestat, read from their minds what happened to Lestat and are offended by the fact that Claudia exists. They don't believe anyone should make a child into a vampire ever. And so, by their laws, that's heresy and is punishable by death. So they kidnap Claudia. A woman named Charlotte, who Claudia wanted created because she believed Louis was going to leave her for Armand, which he does eventually end up with Armand for the next 150 years. And then they burn Charlotte and Claudia and try to bury Louis alive. Now this is all against Lestat's wishes, because Lestat actually beats them there and tells Armand the whole tale. So on top of them reading what happened from their minds, they're hearing it from Lestat and decide arbitrarily to kill Claudia and imprison Louis. Lestat didn't want Claudia to die at all. He was actually pretty pissed when he found out later on that Claudia was killed. It tortures him to this day. And that's pretty much where, the first book ends. Because after that, future events, Lestat goes down into the earth after the events in France, comes up about a century later, joins the rock group called Satan's Night Out, becomes a rock star, right? His music awakens all the vampires around the world, because within his music is the laws and the lore and the history of the vampires. So he creates a lot of enemies, he creates a lot of friends he doesn't know about for quite a few years. He awakens the queen. The queen goes on a rampage, burning every vampire she could find. She's eventually met with resistance from the oldest vampires, Maharet, Makare, Cayman, Marius, Pandora, believe Louis there. Makari comes out of nowhere. Nobody even knew she was coming, and she's the one who eventually cuts the queen's head off, takes the sacred core from her, and becomes the Queen of the Damned, the source vampire. Then after that, Lestat meets a guy who is able to switch bodies. He offers Lestat the chance to become human for a period of time, while this guy becomes a vampire for a period of time, when in reality this guy just wants to steal a vampiric body and leave its inhabitant trapped in his dying body. Lestat gets his body back by transferring his soul into his body and that guy's soul into his friend David Talbot. He then kills that body and creates David Talbot as a vampire in this body thief's body. And that's how David is created. After that, he meets a spirit named Memnoch, who takes him on a tour through heaven and hell, what is believed to be heaven and hell. In which point he meets Jesus. He thinks he meets Jesus. He goes down to hell. He sees Claudia there. He gets his eye ripped out. He gets his eye back later. He brings back the Veil of Veronica, which shakes the vampiric world like all of the remaining children of Satan, who were still, staunchly Christian, take the Veil's existence as proof of the existence of God, at which point in time quite a few of them kill themselves. That was a bad time for the vampires. That was Lestat's fault. Then after Memnoch, what happens is Merrick. So Merrick is a Mayfair, a black Mayfair, a cousin of Mona Mayfair, who later becomes a vampire as well. Louis creates her and then tries to kill himself. Louis survives because Lestat gives his blood to the ashes that were not scattered yet, and Louis comes back. Louis comes back stronger than ever. At this point now, Louis can't even be killed. Time goes on. Lestat goes into a coma inside of a chapel that he owned. He had bought from the daughter of one of his victims during the Memnoch incident. He owns the chapel, and he's laying on the chapel floor for a couple years in a comatose state. Nobody can wake him or anything, but a lot of vampires around the world come there, make a pilgrimage there, and gather under one roof. But during this time, Armand is the enforcer in New Orleans. If there's an undesirable vampire there trying to steal blood from Lestat or kill Lestat in his weakened condition, Armand murdered them. No problems whatsoever. Which makes no sense. Like, Armand and Lestat have this bromance that borders on frenemy. They don't know how they feel about each other, but they need each other, kind of thing. So after Lestat wakes up, he refuses to tell the story of what happened while he was in a coma. He claims his spirit was taken away again by Memnoch. Shush. And then a period of time passes, and he meets Tarquin Blackwood, who's just a random guy who became a vampire. But Tarquin lives in New Orleans, so he is technically under Lestat's rule at the time, because during that time, after the incident with the Queen, the vampires broke the world up into territories. So Louisiana belonged to Lestat. Any vampire who came into Louisiana would be mercilessly slaughtered by Lestat. The same goes for other vampires around the world. I believe Marius took Rome. Pandora took Russia. Like, they had their own territories. So Tarquin pleads with Lestat to help him with something. If only he would wait to kill him. Lestat doesn't kill him. It's during this time he's introduced to the Mayfair family, which Mona is a part of. Rowan Mayfair, the designate of the legacy. If you've read the books, I'm not going to go into that. It's a whole other thing. But basically, the Mayfairs are the wealthiest family in the world, and they were made so by a spirit named Lasher. And Lasher was with the family from ancient Scotland till current times, and that was how they ended up wealthy. So Rowan falls in love with Lestat. That doesn't really much matter, but it's worth note for crossover purposes. Mona eventually is turned into a vampire by Lestat so she could be with Quen, and she was dying anyway, so Lestat figured save her life, give her to Quen. During that incident, Merrick is immolated, helping Quen get rid of a spirit he calls Goblin that was with him his whole life. She destroys Goblin as well as herself. And Lestat sends Mona and Quinn to go learn from Maharet at her compound and read from the histories. This is where things get a little weird for Lestat, because after this incident, things get quiet for a while. He goes off on his own. He disappears into the world. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody can find him until something called the Voice begins to pop up, and the burnings begin again. All over the world, the burnings are happening. The Voice turns out to be Amel, the spirit that possessed the queen and created the vampires. The Sacred Core. The Sacred Core basically came into consciousness again after 6,000 years, and the only reason it came into consciousness again is because the proliferation of the blood was too much of a strain for it to handle. It woke it up. Too many vampires were being made, and it was thinning out too much, and it was just in so much pain. On top of that, it was inside of Makare, who was a deaf-blind mute, and dumb. It was just, Makare is an empty shell. Just a living corpse, essentially. Does nothing, says nothing, thinks nothing. And I guess that scared Amel. And it starts to reach out to vampires around the world, including Lestat. At this point in time, Lestat took the advice of Amel throughout the many years that it was talking to Lestat, and he purchases, rebuilds, and improves upon his mortal home in the Auvergne. So the castle he grew up in, as well as the village, he owns all of that. And even in this time, around 2012, it's still a remote spot. Nobody knows it's there, really. Nobody was really living there. It was just an abandoned village and an abandoned castle somewhere in the middle of France. Lestat bought it, restored it, including the village, which is significant. So, eventually, it's discovered that Amel is this voice. And the vampires come together to decide what to do with Amel. A lot of them want to take him out of Makare, put him in a vat of blood, and just keep him fed on blood that way. And Amel's not happy about that, so he reaches out to a vampire named Rashamandes, who is 6,000 years in the blood, so he could become the host. Rashamandes kills Cayman, Maharet, and kidnaps Makare, so he could take the Sacred Core out of her. This obviously signs his death warrant, because the vampires of the world are never going to stand for one of their own killing, for all intents and purposes, their queen. Everyone around the world loved Maharet and Cayman, and her death was a big hit. So, especially to Lestat, he looked up to her out of everyone, including Marius, who is like a father figure to him. So, at this time, Lestat finds out he has a biological son named Victor. That two vampires, Farid Banzali and Seth, who happens to be the son of Akasha when she was human, they used Lestat's, semen to create Victor. Now, how they got this was Lestat had met them a few years prior to all this going down with the Voice, and Farid talked Lestat into running some tests. He injected some hormones into Lestat and made him able to have sex and produce seed, and from that they created Victor. So, Rashomandis finds out about Victor and kidnaps him and tries to extort Lestat and the Council of Vampires that came together to deal with this crisis to allow him to take the Sacred Core. Now, Lestat, by this time, has been unanimously declared the ruler of the vampires. And I mean by unanimously by Marius, Pandora, Severain, who's 6,000 years in the blood, Gregory Duff Collingsworth, who's 6,000 years in the blood. The very oldest vampires in the world, as well as the very youngest vampires in the world, unanimously vote Lestat to be their ruler, which is why in later books he's known as Prince Lestat. He doesn't take the title of king, he takes the title of prince. And turns his castle in France into the seat of power. The court is what he calls it. So, Lestat, being the brash person he is, just laughs in Rashomandis' face, jumps up on the table, strolls over to Rashomandis, and proceeds to cut his arm off with the axe he has on his person. Everyone's dumbfounded. No one could believe that a 250-year-old vampire would stand up to an ancient like that. That's, tantamount to suicide. Rashomandis can't do anything, though, because Lestat's protected by the elders. So, part of the reason why Lestat was being so brash. He forces Rashomandis to give up on his quest. Later that night, after all that is settled, Makare comes to Lestat and basically chooses him to be the recipient of Amel, the Sacred Core, allowing Lestat to end her life so she could be with her sister, to give him the Sacred Core, by which, again, all the vampires in the world declare Lestat the prince. The Prince of the Damned, Prince Lestat, the ruler of us all. And they retire to their seat of power in France. And that's where the most recent books come up to. So, there isn't really an antagonist in Lestat's life. The antagonist is himself. He gets himself into a lot of trouble. He starts shit with other vampires because at one point, Armand was an enemy. His own fledglings were his enemies. He made an enemy of Akasha at one point. He was her consort, of course. We know this. He drank her blood and ended up turning on her. He was an enemy of Rashomandis. But there was no real protagonist the whole time. Eventually, in the next book, that's when Lestat kills Rashomandis. That's the vampire that I was talking about. So yeah, that's Lestat in a nutshell. I'm sure I left some things out, but this is getting really long. I could explain each book in detail, but towards the end here, I just wanted to gloss over it a little bit and give you the cliff notes of what Lestat was about. What really matters is his origins and the events that are happening now in the book, now that Lestat's the ruler of all vampires. When he becomes the ruler of all vampires, obviously he creates a set of rules, a court, he has a council. He's not really a hands-on ruler. He wants votes and all that stuff. He's a fair ruler. But when it comes time for him to make a decision, he's usually pretty ruthless about it. Everyone knows not to challenge him, and the offer of his blood as a gift is received as sacred, because he's looked up to by every vampire in the world. Doesn't matter how old they are, Lestat is an idol to everyone. That's what makes him such a great protagonist. You know what I mean? That's why the series has been going on for over 30 years. It's why it's so popular, and it's why I think eventually Lestat is going to supplant Dracula as, the vampire archetype. Because if you were a vampire, who would you want to be like? Dracula or Lestat? You know what I mean? The superhero of vampires. James Bond of vampires. I'm going with Lestat every time. Anyway, thank you for watching. Got any questions, comments, you leave them down below. You hit the like button, hit that notification bell. Stay up to date on this channel. My next video is going to be probably based on the Night Angel series. Either the Night Angel series or the Chronicles of the Necromancer. I haven't decided yet. But when I know, you'll know. Thank you.